Welcome back to part 11 of our series where we are building a trading robot for the TD Ameritrade API. So in the last video, we wrapped up pretty much all of the main objects. Now, with that being said, it doesn't mean every object we have done so far is completely finished in all the functionality that we would like to have. However, we do have enough at this point to start writing the main script, which is intended to run the robot. And so now what we can do is we can start writing that script. However, there's a couple things that we're going to need to do more for configuration purposes, right? So a big thing about this is you're going to be using your TD Ameritrade account. Because of that, you're going to need to have your account number. Well, in this particular case, because we're using the TD API library I built, you're going to need a path to your credentials file, or where you would like your credentials to be stored, and some other information, so like your API key. And the idea behind that is that will be used to help authenticate your session with the API. It's very, very important that you authenticate yourself with these sessions. And more specifically, I know sometimes people will try to use just the API key. It's very important to understand that if you use just the API key, you will, in most cases, actually get a successful response. However, especially for market data, it will be delayed. Very important to understand that if you do not provide your authorization, so your access token, you will get delayed market data by about 15 minutes. So that's pretty substantial when you think about that in the terms of trading. That can be a very, very long time depending on which frequency you're trading. Now, something I think I have, no, I'm going to have to put that up there, but I will do it before I upload this video. So something I'm going to upload to the Python trading robot library is a script called write-config. The idea behind write-config is that this will write a configuration file for you that will store your client ID, your redirect URI, your JSON path, so your credentials path, and then your account number as well. So this is a nice standardized way of creating that for you. I personally love this. It just makes it easy, out of the way. I don't have to think about it. And it creates a nice little config.ini file. I'm not going to go in it because it has my account number and stuff like that. But the idea behind it, it will create that file using a config parser, or the config parser library, at which point you can then read that config file in other parts of your script. So very useful. I always encourage people to do this. That's why a lot of times in my videos, you will see me import these config files, and people always ask and they say, hey, where'd you get that config file? That is something that I wrote. And so you can write it too. Everybody can write it. It's a very standard way of writing it, but you want to make sure, especially if this is code that you're planning to share with somebody, that you do not send your credentials along with your code. And so a config file allows you to securely put that in a location that you can then read on your own system, but not necessarily share it out. So really all this little script here is doing is it's importing the config parser object. We just create a new instance of that. And then your config file is divided into sections, right? And so what we're basically saying here on line 6 is we're saying, hey, take our config parser object and we're going to add a new section to it. So we're going to add a section to your file, and we're going to give that section a name. In this case, it's going to be called main. So it's a main section. And then with our section, we can have little variables. And so what we'll do is we'll call our config object, our config parser object, and we'll say, hey, set the variable client ID in the main section equal to, just say XXX, whatever you want. So it's normally your client ID. But the idea here is you're going to assign your variable to your main section, and that variable is going to contain whatever you write in it. And then after you've defined what your config file looks like, we need to write to it. And so what you can do is if you do with open, and then you provide the path to your config file. In this case, we want to do a config.ini file. And we'll do it in write plus mode just to be safe. So if you have a plus here, what that means is if the file does not exist, it will create the file for you. And the W represents the fact that you're saying, I want to write to this file. So I'm going to write to my config file. I'm going to basically just say, take my config object. There is a method called write. And then all you do is you put in that file handle object. So that's denoted by this little F right here. So this is our file handle object. It's kind of like our, well, I mean, you see right there, it's your text IO wrapper. I personally like to think of it as like kind of like my file object. I don't know. For me, it just makes more sense when I think of it like that. And what I'm saying is I want to pass through that file object into my config object's write method. And then this will write that config information to our config file found right here. So it's very important you do that. The alternative, and I don't usually recommend this for people, is you could technically put your consumer key directly in the script. So you could do something like this if you wanted to. I don't recommend that because a lot of times you'll start sharing code or whatever, or somebody comes by and they're going, hey, oh great, here's this account number and everything like that. So normally I like to kind of keep it in a separate file and then I'll import it directly. And that's just good practice in general. So don't necessarily look at it as an extra step, really look at it as something that's helping keeping your information secure. Okay, so with that being said, let's start the process of importing a bunch of libraries because we're going to be using a bunch of them. So the first one, hold on one second, I'm going to turn on my light. It's getting too dark. Okay, so first things first, we are going to be using the time library. So we're going to import time. And normally when I use the time library, for whatever reason, I always seem to be using the date time library at the same time. And then I'll be using the time module inside of that. And so what I'll normally do, just to give myself a little hint, I call the time module as true time. So that's like my true time lib. And the idea behind that is that way I can easily reference it and not get it mixed up with the other time module. Additionally, we'll be printing out some stuff. So I like doing the pretty print module. And then pathlib. Do we use pathlib? I don't think we use pathlib, but I'll take it in anyway, just to be safe. So the pathlib object is, it's really designed for helping working with file paths across different operating systems. So if you're on Linux, if you're on Windows, if you're on Mac, the pathlib module makes it really easy to work with those, and it will handle all the differences that can sometimes arise when you're working with file paths. So for example, on Windows, you can see right here, I have forward slashes, but then on Mac and Linux, will be backward slashes. And so this will help resolve those type of issues. And just it just makes working with file paths a lot easier by asking questions like whether it's a directory or not and things along that nature. And so I've actually, ever since I started using it, I love it. It's basically the one I always go to now. I used to be like a lot of other people would just do the OS module, but this one, I've really liked it and I highly recommend it. And then we're going to be importing the operator module. And so this is a way of actually taking common operators that we work with inside of Python, and we can almost treat them like objects, and we can treat them like methods and functions that if we don't want to necessarily type out, greater than or equal, we can actually use a function that represents that same type of operation. Additionally, we will be using pandas. Oh, not that. And then we'll be importing pandas. It's common for a lot of people to give pandas an alias. And so you'll see PD. And then we're going to be using datetime. So we're going to say from datetime, import datetime. It's very common. So the datetime object is a nice way for us to represent actual dates and times. And we can do all sorts of operations with those date times. So for example, we can add date times, subtract date times, lots of good stuff. And because we're going to be doing a lot of operations with date time, we need to actually import the time delta object. And so this is something that is very important when it comes to working, I think a lot of times in real-time markets, is you have to calculate a lot of times. And so there's waiting, there's, maybe waiting until the next bar, there's trying to figure out when I should pull something else based on the given time. So a lot of operations when we're working with market data have to do with some type of time operation. And so being able to easily add and subtract different times is crucial, and time delta will allow us to do that because we can say, hey, take my date time object and add 7 hours to it. So that time delta object will make that much easier for us. And then we're going to be working with the config parser object, obviously, because we need to import our config data. And so we're just going to import that config parser object. Okay, and then from here, we're going to say from pyrobot.pyrobot. We're going to, oh, sorry, not pyrobot, robot import pyrobot. Just an FYI, you will see, at least on my system right now, you notice how you're seeing 2 of these, and in some cases you're seeing 2 other stuff like that. The reason why is because technically I have my own installed version of the library, and then I had the one that I'm doing the video on. So don't be surprised if you see 2 on mine. You shouldn't be seeing 2 because you should just be installing the library unless you want to write it from scratch. You can take the one I already have and then go through and modify it. But on mine, don't be surprised if we start seeing this. So we're going to import our robot object. And then the next thing that we're going to be importing is our indicators object as well. In this one, I call it indicator. So I'm just going to leave it like that. I should rename that. And then inside of that, it's indicators. And then I'll actually, just to be consistent, I'll rename that to indicators. Okay. And then from here, so that's good. Very useful. Okay. Once we've done that, we need to load our configuration values. So we'll grab the config file values. And so to do that, we're going to say config equals, it's going to be the config parser. We're going to read that config parser, but we need to provide the file path. So it's going to be configs/config.ini. This is a relative path, relative to the file that I'm currently in. A nice, easy way to get the relative path inside of Visual Studio Code is you right-click the file that you want to get the relative path for. And you can see down here, there's copy path and copy relative path. In this case, we obviously want the relative path. So if you put it in there, it normally looks like that. For me, I like to be a little bit safe and just do the /. So that will provide and read the config file. And now I just need to load my config. And so the first one is going to be main. And then we're going to say we want that client ID value. And we're basically going to do this a few different times. Redirect URI, that's going to be config.get main. And then it's going to be redirect URI. And then credentials path equals config.get. It's in the main section and it has a name of JSON path. And then the final one will be our account number. So obviously we're going to be making trades. So we're going to get an account number. Again, that's in my main section and that is under the name account number. Okay, so this will load all of our values. So all we've done at this point is we have literally just read some values. Then from here, we are going to initialize the robot. And then from here, we'll create a new variable. We'll call it trading robot. And that's going to be assigned to our pyrobot object. And you can see here we have a nice little hint as to what we need to provide. The first one is our client ID. So we provide our client ID, which is also sometimes called your API key and even consumer key. We then have our redirect URI. We then have our credentials path. And then we also have a final, a trading account. Trading account. That will just be our account number. And then something I'm going to talk to a little bit about. It's not technically done yet, but I have started kind of working through the process. So I'm going to mimic doing paper trading, at least as best I can. So imagine this isn't here for a second. If we wanted to walk through the same step again, then we are going to add a new argument, and we're going to call that paper trading. Paper trading will have a type of Boolean, and we'll default it to true. So I'm going to assume, unless you tell me otherwise, that guess what? When you want to do paper trading, you're going to want it to be true. And then, delete that for a second, we're going to add a new attribute to our wonderful PyRobot object, and we'll call it paper trading. And that will simply equal the paper trading value that was passed through, or the default value if the user does not choose to specify it. So in this situation right here, where is it? You don't have to add it in, so you don't have to be explicit and say, well, I want it to be paper trading. I personally like to be explicit, so I always like to add it even if I know it's the default value. However, if you don't, you can also do false. Keep in mind though, if it's false, it will submit that order. So again, if I want to be explicit, I'll just put true. So that initializes our robot. So now we're going to start jumping into the next topic. The PyRobot object, or our robot object in general, is serving as the gateway to the other objects that we've created. So you've noticed that we've created a portfolio object, we've created an indicators object, we've created a stock frame object, and we've created a trades object. Now, technically speaking, these are these own separate objects, so they don't technically have to be attached to my robot object. But I would like some type of gateway where when I create these objects, I'm doing it from my main robot object. Because the idea behind it is that there's information that is very important for, say, my portfolio object that's going to exist in my PyRobot object. So there is a relationship. There is some type of information that I might need to transfer from my robot object into my portfolio object. So that's why I always envisioned it as anytime I want to do anything, it's from the robot object. Now, it technically doesn't have to be like that. You could technically initialize everything from the individual object itself. However, I think from an organization perspective, it's a lot easier to just do it through the robot object. And I think it's more intuitive. So if you remember many videos ago, we defined a few methods. One was create portfolio. One was create trade. Another was create stock frame. And then we had another one for getting quotes and gridding historical quotes. So we are going to fill in this one. And then this is the initialized portfolio one. So I'll delete that for a second and we'll walk through it together. So the idea behind the create portfolio object is we need to first initialize a new portfolio object. Now, the other thing is you have to technically import it because it doesn't exist right now. So you go up to your imports, you're going to do from PyRobot, and then you're going to have your portfolio object, and then you're going to do portfolio. Now, just as a reminder, if you go onto my GitHub right now with the trading robot, you will see a lot more in that one than you currently see in this one. So when you go to the portfolio one, you're going to see a lot more methods and stuff like that. You'll even see doc strings and all that kind of fun stuff. That's because this one is much further along than the one in my video. And it's intended to be like that. So the idea is that I'm going to add to this over time. People are going to contribute. People are going to say, hey, I think it should be done like this. We'll come to our agreements. And then from there, we're going to add that functionality. So at this point in time, this is the functionality we have access to. It's not to say it's going to stay like that, but over time, you will see new functionality added. However, just keep in mind, you're going to see discrepancies right now within what you're seeing in this one compared to what you're going to see on GitHub. So don't be surprised about that. So the first thing I want to do is I want my portfolio object to be an attribute of my robot object. So I'm going to say, I'm going to create a new attribute. We're going to call it self.portfolio. That will equal my portfolio object. And then that will equal my account number. and it's going to be self.trading account. So I'm going to create a portfolio that is associated with my trading account. And then from here, I'm going to also assign the client to it, the client being the TD Ameritrade API client. And so the way I do that is I'll have portfolio. Oh, I don't know if I added this one in here yet. So I want to add it. Yeah, I'll add it, but I'm just going to copy it just to save myself a little bit of the time. Where did I put it? Something I like to always do is I like to be able to access objects across across the different objects. And so one way I do that is by adding them as properties of different ones. So kind of going back to the component object model. And so this is kind of similar to what you've seen in other videos. However, all I've done, again, just to kind of clarify, I'm currently on my portfolio object. All I've done to this portfolio object is I've created a property that belongs to it. The name of this property is TD underscore client. It represents a TD client object. Now, if I don't import it here at the top, it's not going to know what it does. So what I do, and then something too is a requirement to use this library is you obviously have to have the client one. So I do from td.client import the TD client object. So all I'm saying here is that there's going to be a property. It's going to be called TD underscore client, and that's going to equal my TD client object. So if I call this property, I'm going to be returned self underscore TD client. Now, it's important to also note that up here, I need to add that attribute here. So I'm going to say underscore TD client, and we'll initialize it to none. If I want to have type hinting for my attribute, I'm just going to do TD client. And then from here, I'm going to scroll back down. So this is my getter. I need a setter for my property as well because it's initialized to none. So this is a property that I have to set after I create a new session. So what we do in order to create a setter is we say at the property name followed by period setter. So this is the setter for my TD client property. I give it the same name. However, with this one, I'm actually going to have a value that I pass through or assign to it. So I'm assigning a value called TD underscore client. You can technically name this value Bob, whatever you want. However, you just need to say there's a value, and I'm doing more type hinting here. So I'm saying, hey, this is a TD client object. Doesn't return anything because when I'm setting it, I'm not sending anything back. And this is a little bit overkill. I don't really need that there. But all I'm saying is that this is just being assigned the TD client object. So I'm just assigning to my property the TD client object. That's all. So that's all this is intended to do. So going back to my robot object, I'm going to say self.portfolio. Now I have my TD client property, and that's going to equal my self.session property because in my robot object, my session is my client. Finally, after that, I'm going to return that portfolio object back to me. Since we're here, we're going to also do the get quotes or grab current quotes. This one, because we've kind of done it in other videos, we're just going to kind of walk through it and kind of go from here. It's not anything super complicated. So the grab current quotes method, what are you thinking it's doing? Well, it's just going to grab all the quotes in our portfolio. And so the first thing I need to do is I need to get all the symbols inside of my portfolio. Well, remember that when we created our portfolio object, there is a property called positions. The positions, it's in the name, the positions are all the symbols or the positions you currently have in your portfolio. And so you can see that it's initialized to an empty dictionary, but then we've created two methods that allow us to add positions to that dictionary. So you can see in each one of these, I'm simply adding a position to to the main dictionary. So we also notice that the key for our positions dictionary is the symbol. That's important to note, because now that gives us an easy way of grabbing all the symbols in my portfolio just like that. Super easy. So all I have to do is I call my portfolio object. I know there's an attribute called positions in there, and I know that's a dictionary. And I know a dictionary object has a keys method, which returns all the keys inside that dictionary. So I now have a list of all of my symbols. I then call my session object, which is really just my TD client object. And I know my TD client object has a get quotes. I'm going to hover over it, a get quotes method, where I just have to pass through a list of symbols. And that's the instruments argument. So all I do is I call my instruments argument, and then I pass through a list of my symbols. This will return a dictionary of quotes. And then all I'm going to do is pass that back to the call. That's all. So now that we've done that, first, how long have I been going? 27, good Lord. I'm going to call it off right here. So in the next video, we're going to keep going through this, and we're going to add some positions to our portfolio, and then we'll test grabbing quotes. However, at this point, if you have any questions, by all means, ask away. Otherwise, we'll see you in the next video, video number 12. Woo!